is Zachary Logan. I'm an artist from Regina, Saskatchewan, where I have a studio full-time. And my work encompasses the human body and landscape, often coupled with art historical references. And today I'm filming this a short artist talk from Wave Hill Botanical Gardens, which is in the Bronx in New York City along the Hudson River. And back in 2016, I did a residency here. It's a really great program, and it's offered to artists who have interest in botany and the natural world in their visual work. And so that happens in the wintertime, and in the summertime, they host exhibitions, so it becomes a museum space. So the exhibition that I've been here in New York installing is called The Shadow of the Sun, Ross Bleckner and Zachary Logan. So the other artist, so it's a two-person exhibition, and the other artist in the exhibition is New York-based painter Ross Bleckner. And both of us have overlapping themes of landscape and the body. And so our works were paired together by curator Wayne Berwald, and then that exhibition happened in Saskatchewan, and then this one came about through contact with Wave Hill and Jennifer McGregor, who's co-curator with Leah Taylor from the Kendernine Galleries in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. So just to talk a little bit about my practice, my body is always the catalyst for my work, whether or not my physical body is present or not. So in earlier works, the work was centered around the idea of self-portraiture or the rendering of self, and often in reference to a lot of art historical imagery and periods in art history. And then the work just sort of started to shift to ideas of the natural world and ecology and bodies within space. And another sort of overlapping theme in my work is the idea of queerness, the idea of rewilding one's body as an act of queerness, as a visual nod to queerness. So in a lot of the work in this exhibition, there's a conversation between myself and Ross Bleckner. And both of us are often thinking about the landscape and the human body in the landscape and how we affect the world. So for example, in my work, I'm often thinking about certain parts of the landscape and certain aspects of how we talk about the landscape socially as humans. So for example, I'm very interested in the idea of the notion of weeds and the notion of invasive species. I think it's very ironic that humans will talk about non-human beings as being invasive. So, for example, why is a weed a weed? Well, a weed is deemed a weed because it has no human use. It has no use for human consumption, but it still has a very real need and desire to thrive. And so I think a lot about the way that in which we, as a society, talk about plants and the overlap in which we talk about ourselves socially, and that relates to the notion of natural or unnatural and sexuality, being certain sexualities being okay or natural or sort of good intrinsically, and other sexualities being wrong or unnatural or not good. And so those sorts of themes come through in the work in sometimes subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways. And oftentimes I will also make a lot of references to other artists, both contemporary, but I would would say more so historically. So one of those artists is Mary Delaney. Mary Delaney was a 17th century artist, or sorry, 18th century artist who worked with paper collage. And so she created these remarkable botanical renderings out of hundreds, if not sometimes thousands, of pieces of paper. Very remarkable work, and it was all through just through observation. So she had to hand dye, hand cut all of these pieces of paper, and they're very, very small works, and they're remarkable. They hold up. You know, they're made out of paper, so it's a very sort of delicate material, and all of that work is held in the British Museum collection. So some of the works that I reference of hers are in this exhibition. And I guess I should, maybe because we're right in front of it, I'll talk a little bit about this piece. So this piece is called Fountain. And the genesis of this work came out of the experience of a couple of different things. One was seeing the monument of Oscar Wilde, in which as I approached it, I thought it was covered in red moss, in plant, but it actually was covered with lipstick. So people put on lipstick and kissed the tomb of Oscar Wilde, you know, as a thanks or a tribute to him. And so just that idea of all of these people coming to this monument and affecting it in their own way was really appealing to me, and really, it was sort of the genesis of the idea of this fountain. And then the other sort of related to the body in terms of the materials that I use. So it's fired clay, but I left it this sort of bone color because for me it has a very real reference to the landscape in Saskatchewan and the history of you know, what happened in Saskatchewan, you know, in the British colonial enterprise. And how it really transformed the landscape. So what happened was most of the buffalo were killed off, and there are these horrific photographs of thousands and thousands of buffalo bones that are stacked with, you know, men standing either on top of the pile of bones or next to them. And so this is a definite visual reference to that as well. And every time I show this piece, there are more flowers that are around the edge. So it really is sort of a piling of bones and an idea of remembrance. But it has sort of different sort of connotations. And in a way, it is a representation of the landscape itself. And you know, a lot of the works that I do are through observation, but also through creation. So it's a mixture of memory and recollection. So a lot of my drawings and a lot of my ceramics are sort of formed the way that, or realized the way that a Dutch still life would be realized. So, you know, taken of the natural world, but also fictive, because a lot of the flowers that exist in a botanical painting in the Dutch still life tradition, they wouldn't be blooming together at the same time. So there's a bit of a fiction, but also there's a truth in relation to, I think, some of the underlying themes that the Dutch artists were getting at, which was, you know, ideas of mortality, and perhaps the last thing I should talk about is my ideas around empathy for the beings around us, which include the plants and the non-human animals. So, you know, I think in my drawings and in my ceramics, I'm wanting to try to slow people down and get them to look, that's one thing, but also think about the natural world and the world around them in a slightly different way, and to sort of open up and maybe create a dialogue around empathy.